The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 3rd of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, US President Joe Biden blames jet lag for his poor debate performance last week. Washington reporter Simon Marks joins me here in studio to discuss the latest. What's the mood in DC right now, Simon?
Well, I think, Chris, the mood is that time is running out for Joe Biden to shore up support within the Democratic Party for staying in the presidential race.
We'll talk about that. Afterwards, we'll look at the introduction of Japan's first new banknotes in 20 years. We'll get the latest business headlines, and we'll hear about the life of an Albanian literary hero, Ismail Kadare. And finally,
it's raising a few eyebrows because you're kind of expecting all of them to either wear head-to-toe clothing and cover up with scarves any tattoos that might be peeping through their clothes.
A roundup of news from the Vatican with Juliet Linley in Zurich. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. It has been almost a week since a debate performance that turned the U.S. presidential election race on its head, with Democrats fretting over their candidate, Joe Biden, while Republicans celebrate that their candidate, Donald Trump, is largely free of legal troubles thanks to a Supreme Court that has granted him selective immunity for his actions. Even his one conviction over hush money payments to Stormy Daniels now hangs in the balance, or the sentencing for that at least. Well, joining me now in the studio is Washington-based correspondent Simon Marks. Good afternoon, Simon.
Good afternoon to you, Chris.
How is your jet lag, if I can ask, given this is the topic of the day? How do you deal with jet lag? Do we have some sympathies here for Joe Biden's excuses?
We do have some sympathies. I mean, I am lucky enough to do an enormous amount of international travel and invariably find myself always waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning thinking that it's time to get up and, get up and at 'em. So I did think at the time that it was questionable, the decision that the White House engaged in, to have Joe Biden at the age of 81, so with less stamina than perhaps a young man like I enjoy. I thought it was questionable to fly him from Washington, D.C. to Normandy for D-Day, then bring him back to the United States for 3 days, and then send him back across the Atlantic to Bari for the G7 summit. I mean, at the time, I thought, why doesn't he just kill 3 days in Europe? There must be people that he could be going to see and places he could have gone to visit. But, now this notion that the poor debate performance is being blamed by the president on jet lag is a story change, because we were being told last week he just had a cold. Now there's less talk about the cold and there's more discussion of the jet lag.
Which does go to show the kind of damage control that is happening right now in the Democratic Party. What is the sense, what sense do you get of the mood right now in Washington? I do imagine it's pretty frenetic, frankly, is all that I can imagine of what's happening. All these different discussions of what Joe Biden might have done. And frankly, when it comes to this, I mean, you're right to a degree. We can have some sympathy with an 81-year-old man suffering from jet lag. But at the same time, he is president of the United States. It is one of the world's most demanding jobs. So how is this being treated in DC?
I think we've seen a real shift in the last 24 hours. I mean, yesterday, suddenly, tectonic plates were moving and the dam was beginning to break. You saw Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas become the first elected member of the House of Representatives on the Democratic side openly to call for Joe Biden to stand down. We have seen anger on the part of some other elected Democrats, governors all over the country, who say they cannot understand why there's been no White House call set up. In fact, there is going to be a White House call in a few hours' time, but belatedly after the governors all groused that there'd been no outreach from Joe Biden and his campaign team to explain to them what on earth was going on. We've seen anger among some stalwart members of Joe Biden's support team over the move by the Biden family following that emergency summit meeting that they held at Camp David on Sunday to point the finger of blame at staff who had been engaged in the president's debate prep for a couple of days at Camp David last week. Jen Psaki, the former White House press secretary, now a host on MSNBC, furiously tweeting about that and offering words of support for those staffers, including the former White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, who then tweeted back at Jen Psaki to thank her for the message of support that she had offered. So I think that there is this growing sense that time is running out for Joe Biden comprehensively to try and keep people on board. Now, he's giving an interview to ABC News, but that's not happening until Friday, and the full interview won't run until Sunday. The White House says that he will hold a proper press conference next week. But, you know, he's now in such a vulnerable position that if in any of those appearances he makes another unforced error, I mean, that will completely put paid to any hope, I think, that he can remain the Democratic Party's presidential candidate.
It is quite incredible how fast-paced this is. As you describe, we're just talking about a matter of days, whether it's a press conference, an interview. I mean, that goes, I suppose, to the fact that this is urgent for Democrats, because if they are going to make any kind of move, if there were to be talk about a replacement, it has to happen before a convention. Something has to be put in place. You know, you're not going to have a primary selection process anymore. But whatever they're going to do, they would need to prod Joe Biden to step aside now.
They've got to get on with it. It is already, in American political terms, way too late. I mean, we sit here in London, where the UK is about to wrap up an entire election campaign that has taken 6 weeks. The French are doing it in 4. The Indians did it in 44 days. The American process is longer than a year. And at this stage, it is very late for any political party to be considering replacing its presidential candidate. The opportunity for Joe Biden to get out of his decision to run was last summer, last fall. At times, it looked like he might take it. But then the off-year election results were strong for Democrats, and he and the family members that are key in this decision-making process decided that he was going to tough it out. Now, suddenly, he's running into quicksand. And for the party, the need to move this process, if it is going to happen rapidly, is here and now, because the Republican convention is taking place in the middle of this month. The Democratic convention takes place 5 weeks later in Chicago. And if you're going to avoid the prospect of a brokered convention, which would see, for the first time since the 1960s, a party engaged in open disunity, in a battle to choose a candidate that late in the game, you've got to get on with it now and allow the various candidates. It's going to be very complicated, because people like Kamala Harris, the vice president, she's absolutely going to want to put her hat in the ring. And then there's lots of others, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, Gavin Newsom in California, other potential candidates out there. This process needs to happen now. And the difficulty from the Democrats' broader perspective is that none of those candidates in polling, even this week, including Joe Biden, none of them defeats Donald Trump in November.
Well, and just finally on that point quickly, Simon, when it comes to Donald Trump, he has obviously had good news this week, because the Supreme Court has also partially at least upheld the idea that he has immunity. He's now challenging the sentencing that was going to happen in the case of Stormy Daniels and the hush money payments there. What is your sense on that side? I mean, is anything, I guess the other question here is just, has anything on this moved the polls? Are Republicans kind of celebrating at this point by comparison?
Well,
or are they also a bit worried?
Yeah, I think Republicans certainly feel increasingly confident. I mean, the polls, we're waiting to see exactly what the impact of last Thursday's debate was in the polling. But on the eve of that debate, Joe Biden had a 1 percentage point lead over Donald Trump. That certainly already appears to have reversed. That sentencing of Donald Trump now scheduled for September the 11th. I mean, I think it will be, I will be surprised if it happens then. It could get pushed back even further as a result of this process. All of that feeds into Democratic Party anxiety. There's fury with the judicial system on the part of many Democrats for not having completed these prosecutions, all of them, of Donald Trump, and to see the one in which he has been convicted now sort of being kicked into the long grass in terms of the sentencing, that frustrates them as much as it delights Republicans who see the possibility of their candidate going into this election maybe, only convicted and not yet sentenced while his appeal as a result of this Supreme Court ruling plays out.
What a week it's been. Thank you very much, Simon Marks, for joining us. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Thousands of Palestinians have fled their homes in southern Gaza following a bombardment by Israeli forces after issuing a new evacuation order for the city of Khan Yunis. At least 8 people have been killed and more than 30 wounded in strikes. Chinese Coast Guard officials have seized a Taiwanese fishing vessel and taken it to a port in mainland China. The Taiwanese boat was operating during China's no-fishing period. Taiwan says it will communicate with Beijing to urge them to release the fishermen as soon as possible. And in Japan, the historic Bukchan Hanok village is set to have a curfew for visitors starting in March next year, as the popular destination struggles with over-tourism. The central area will be closed for visitors from 1700 to 2200 every day. Those who break the regulations will be charged a fine of around $70. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. To Japan now, which today releases a series of new banknotes. It is the first redesign of the currency in about 2 decades and comes as the yen is plunging to new lows against the dollar. That reality is something Japan's government has been leaning into today, with Prime Minister Kishida saying he hopes the new notes will help energize the country's economy. Well, joining me for more is Peter Landers, Tokyo Bureau Chief for The Wall Street Journal. Peter, great to have you on the show. Tell us first of all about the new faces on these Japanese banknotes, the bills, and what do they say about kind of who is revered in Japan?
They're looking for people who are relatively uncontroversial, so no politicians in this group. There's an educator, a doctor, a medical researcher, and a businessman, Eiichi Shibusawa. Most of them from the pre-war period in Japan before World War II, and I guess it shows it's easier to revere someone who helped people and saved people through medical discoveries as opposed to a particular politician, especially in the pre-war period when there was so much strife.
I guess that does say something about Japan at the moment. Politicians not necessarily popular. How are they kind of selling this new revived currency and the new banknotes? What are they saying about the importance of it?
Well, it's really, I think, to honor these individuals. I might point to, Umeko Tsuda, the founder of a leading women's university in Japan. She was sent to the United States at the age of 6, I believe, to be one of the first Japanese women to study abroad. For centuries, no one was allowed to leave the country at all, male or female. And in the Meiji period, we're talking the late 19th century, Japan opened up to the world and sent some bright young people to Europe and the U.S. to study. And Tsuda was one of those people. And so she, of course, became fluent in English, studied at Bryn Mawr University in the United States, and then again came back to Japan to found one of the leading women's universities here. So I think it's an honor for her. It's an honor for the others who contributed to society.
And tell us about the design as well. There are sort of security upgrades, things like that. What can you tell us about why these banknotes were necessary from that perspective?
I think they wanted to update the security protections, and these are very finely detailed portraits of the three individuals, and they're hoping that it will prevent any counterfeiting.
And also, I guess when it comes to this question of counterfeiting, I mean, just tell us a little more about how much the Japanese still use cash. How much are these banknotes? How much is the yen itself revered?
Cash has been king in Japan, as it is in Germany, I hear as well. But that has changed. And in fact, a number of visitors to Japan, I was here all through the pandemic, and change happens little by little. Sometimes you don't notice, but a number of people who were regular visitors to Japan in 2018 and 19, and then were prevented from visiting the country during the pandemic and came back in, let's say, last year, 2023, these people told me the biggest change they observed here was the introduction of cashless payment methods. There had been some before, with always credit cards, of course, but now various smartphone apps and other methods of paying without cash. So I would say increasingly fewer people are using these 10,000, 5,000, 1,000 yen notes on a daily basis.
Now, Peter, when it comes to the economy as well, I did just want to ask you, the fact that Prime Minister Kishida sort of spoke about these new banknotes, saying he hopes they will help energize the Japanese economy. What does that say to you, I wonder? I mean, can new banknotes help revive an economy? Will it instill any kind of, national pride, revival in consumer spending? Those kinds of things that Kishida is clearly hoping for, because the yen is struggling at the moment.
That's right. I don't think the introduction of new banknotes would have a serious impact on the economy, especially since, as we discussed, fewer people are using the banknotes every day. Kishida himself needs a lift pretty quickly because his approval ratings or the approval ratings for his cabinet are roughly around 25%. And way below the level that he would need to score an election victory. And Japan must hold an election for Parliament's more powerful lower house by next fall of 2025. So he's looking for a difficult election, and he may not, in fact, survive as prime minister unless he can get a quick boost for his popularity. So certainly he would hope that something nice happens after today.
And just finally on that, Peter, is there anything else you're expecting from Kishida or the government when it comes to trying to revive the yen, something a little less symbolic?
Yes, the government has intervened a couple of times this year with actual purchases of yen using their stash of dollars. And the Japanese government has built up a war chest of some $1 trillion over the years, intervening in the other direction to sell yen and to buy dollars. Now they're dipping into some of that dollar stash to prop up the yen, and it has not had a big impact. They spent more than $60 billion to do it in April and May, and the yen kind of fell back to where it had been. But they have more where that came from, and certainly every day people in the foreign exchange market are watching for possible government intervention with money and not just new banknotes.
Peter Landers, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Time now for us to get the latest business news with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, always good to have you on the show. There's been a jump in Tesla shares. We're going to start with that. It's been a bit of a rocky ride for the last couple of years, really, for Tesla, and they've had falling sales. So what's going on?
Blimey, yeah, it certainly has. Tesla reported its second consecutive quarterly drop in deliveries, but the drop was a little less steep than a number of forecasts were analysing. A number of analysts were forecasting, I should say. And that's seeing a fair bit of optimism in the market. Shares jumping 10% yesterday. And as you mentioned, it has been a rocky old year for Tesla. Elon Musk announcing steep job cuts back in April. As many as 20% of staff were apparently on the hook. The sales teams in particular came in for a real bashing. Their latest new product, the Cybertruck, well, sales of that have been ramping up very slowly. They haven't broken out the numbers, but looking at the recall figures, we can estimate that they've only delivered about 11,000 of those. So not a huge number of deliveries of the Cybertruck. And as for the rest of the range, well, we've all seen them on the streets, but the range has not been updated for a very long time. Companies normally update their cars much more than Tesla has. So they're still selling the same old cars, the same old product that they were a long time ago. And that's come in for a lot of criticism for Elon Musk. Just looking at the shares, really interesting to look at the share price of Tesla. The company's worth just over $700 billion at its current value. That's still a very long way off its 2021 peak when it was worth almost twice as much as that. But just to put it in a bit of context, the world's biggest car maker, the company which delivers the most cars in the world, which is Toyota, is worth a mere $325 billion. So less than half as much as Tesla.
Quite an extraordinary drop, I should say, there from Tesla over the last year or so. But one other story that we wanted to look at, European power prices are also surging at the moment. What can you tell us about that?
Chris, yeah, this is a great story by my colleague Javier Blas. It may have passed you by, but last Tuesday was an extraordinary day in the European electricity market. Just after sunrise on June 25th, the cost of power in the wholesale market climbed 3,000% above typical levels, much worse than any of the spikes we saw during the energy crisis after Putin's invasion on Ukraine. Now, unknown to many at the time, the chaotic prices weren't genuine, rather the product of a faulty computer at the centre of the exchange system where European short-term electricity is traded. The exact causes of the chaos are still unknown. The exchange has been quite tight-lipped on that. They do say it has been fixed, though. European short-term electricity prices are set in the so-called day-ahead market via competitive auctions. And although prices are typically set for individual nations, the auctions consider not just national supply and demand, but also cross-border flows, which these days are increasingly important. And in the industry jargon, the European market is normally coupled. That is, that power can travel, say, from a dam in Norway to Denmark and from there into Germany. And a computer program, the coupling algorithm, keeps the market glued together. Calculating flows and prices all sounds terribly complex, but somehow that crucial bit of market plumbing failed last week, and it resulted in what insiders call a partial decoupling. And for 24 hours, short-term power prices were calculated as if the European market was several unconnected national islands. Now, the author of the piece warns that a faulty computer is one thing, but we need to be prepared for the failure of a bit of physical infrastructure, such as the cross-border cable. And as we move towards more and more power travelling across borders, perhaps we need to make sure the system is really up to it.
Faulty computers. Do you remember the fat button driving shares nuts a few years ago as well? Thanks very much to Ewan Potts there. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Albania is in mourning this week and will hold a funeral today for the world-renowned writer Ismail Kadare, winner of the first International Man Booker Prize and, well, a hero in his home country. He died at the age of 88 this week, and Monocle's Andrew Muller has met Kadare in Paris and joins me now here in studio. Andrew, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Tell us about him, first of all. What was it like to meet him? Tell us about his character, his personality, I suppose.
This was a few years back. It was an interview for Monocle magazine, a section which was always a fun one to write called National Icon, whereby we profiled somebody who was a massive whoop in their home country, arguably not quite as well known elsewhere. Kadare, very probably the most famous Albanian of his time. Certainly it was either him or Enver Hoxha, the unlamented dictator who walled Albania off from the world for much of the 20th century and was, though it's not clear how much Hoxha realised this, the subject of a lot of Kadare's novels. At the time I met him, he was living in an apartment in Paris where he'd lived since the early 1990s. He was already, quite elderly, and his work, as he explained, had slowed down mostly to the occasional essay. But he was, I think in the way of the great artists, talking to him was much like reading him. He was very terse, very droll, and he did think through things. You did have to think about what he was saying as he was saying it. But his novels are also much about the layers you have to wrap around yourself to live in a place as preposterous as Albania was.
What kind of impact do you think then he had on Albanian society when you talk about that, him with his novels kind of trying to, well, probably help Albanians themselves wrap themselves around what was happening in their country, the communist era, and sort of coming out of that?
It varied the degree to which Albanians during that period were actually able to read his works. He was sort of banned and blacklisted a couple of times. He fell in and out of favour with the regime, who on the one hand realised that he was a great asset. They could send him abroad and say, look, he's a writer. We're not quite the crazed Stalinist weirdos we're often characterised as, but he did write things that made him intermittently unpopular with the regime. I think since communism collapsed in Albania, he has become a source of enormous national pride to Albanians. Albanians are an extremely patriotic people. They're also quite hyper-aware of the fact that their country rather unfairly does have a certain reputation abroad. So the idea that they have this great literary eminence among them is, I mean, it's a real thing. It's impossible to avoid noticing when you go to the international airport at Tirana, that where most countries in the world, most cities in the world, where London, for example, would just have rows and rows of teddy bears dressed as beefeaters, they have rows and rows of quite highbrow fiction written by Ismail Kadare.
It's interesting looking at your piece that you did write for Monocle magazine. I just wanted to read one quote which goes into some of this from him. He says, "It was like living two lives, one as an Albanian writer, one as a European writer. It became very complicated. Was I bourgeois or a communist? The communists thought I didn't like Albania, that I wasn't one of them. I got used to it eventually." Do you think that started to narrow towards the end of his life, given the fact that, as you're talking about, he was eventually revered in Albania as well?
I think it became easier for him. When communism collapsed, as I think the piece also says, there was an idea at large in some parts of Albania that he could be drafted as president, as sort of the same trajectory that Václav Havel followed in Czechoslovakia. He was, I think, quite sensibly uninterested in that prospect. He did explain quite cheerfully that he now enjoyed going back to Albania, but found it very difficult because when he went back to Albania, he did not get any time to himself. He was recognised everywhere he went. Everybody wanted to speak to him. Everyone wanted to spend time with him, get their picture taken with him. I think he did quite enjoy that eventually. But the moment that stuck in my head, he did mention early on that he and Enver Hoxha were born not only in the same city but in the same street. And I did ask, did you ever meet? Was there ever an encounter between the two most famous Albanians? And there was a period during which he'd been appointed to what passed for Albania's parliament and I asked him what he did during that time, and he cheerfully replied, nothing at all. But there was a moment where Hoxha, in the manner of most bumpkin tyrants, wanted to be seen as a great intellectual, so made this great show of presenting Kadare with some works by Balzac, and they did have a brief interaction, but Kadare decades later still seems somewhat bemused by the experience.
I can imagine. Well, just finally, Andrew, can you say anything about what has been happening this week in Albania? There will be a funeral today. How has this been marked in Albania?
If you look at Albanian press and statements by Albanian politicians, it has been as you would expect. I don't think there are many other countries in the world which would have this great unifying cultural figure. His funeral today will be an extremely big thing. It will be marked across Albanian media, and the phrase "a nation in mourning" has acquired the sort of leadenness of cliche, but I think today it's entirely applicable.
Andrew Muller, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It's been a busy start to the week in Vatican City, and for a roundup of the headlines, I'm joined now from our Zurich studio by Juliet Linley, journalist and former Vatican correspondent. Good afternoon, Juliet.
Hello, Chris.
Juliet, we're going to start with this rather bizarre schism that's kind of hard to look away from over the last couple of weeks, really, and is getting, I feel like, something out of control. An archbishop who's denying Pope Francis's legitimacy.
Yeah, we're talking about Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano. Now, he's a very controversial figure. He's been a long-standing critic of Francis, and he's actually been in hiding for years, so he hasn't been in Rome. He was formerly the papal envoy to Washington, so very well respected. But slowly over the years, his reputation has been starting to decline, if you want, and he's repeatedly been calling on the Pope to resign, claiming that Francis is not the legitimate leader of the Catholic Church. Now, here's the news angle. In early June, he was summoned to stand trial on schism charges at the Vatican and for making these public statements allegedly denying fundamental elements that are needed to stay in communion with the Church. And the deadline just passed, and Vigano did not appear. So that deadline has expired, and Vigano simply on June 28th, when the deadline expired, simply went on social media to say that he saw no reason to accept these accusations, and he continued accusing Francis of heresy and schism. Now, if you just want to quickly look at those two terms, so schism is a canonical crime, and it's about no longer submitting to the Pope as the supreme leader, if you wish, and heresy is, denying the truths that you should believe as a Catholic, put in very, very simple terms.
And what kind of signal is this, I guess, about sort of a broader schism, to continue using that terms, between sort of conservatives and Pope Francis himself? Does this Archbishop have any support, or is he completely isolated in this stand?
No, that's very interesting. So a lot of the ultra-conservative Catholics were or have been sort of behind Vigano. And when he's chosen to make some of his very outrageous statements against the Pope, he has chosen well-known conservative Vatican journalists to put out those statements. But interestingly, if you want, now you've got several well-known Vatican correspondents who are known for their conservative stance, who are saying the Pope has been patient enough. The time has now come. It's been long overdue. Vigano has to be reined in. So that's interesting.
And just quickly to follow up on that, what happens next?
Well, this is it. The trial apparently will go ahead in any case. And I was talking to one Vatican analyst who was saying, actually, some of the things that Vigano has done would usually be worthy of excommunication. So watch this space, Chris. Let's see what's going to happen.
Well, we will definitely watch that space, but let's move on to some somewhat happier news from the Vatican. We're about to get our first millennial saint. What can you tell us about that?
This is interesting. So millennial, because this soon-to-be-called saint, he should be canonized next year, was born in London in 1991. So he is called Carlo Acutis, and he died aged 15 of leukemia in 2006. So 18 years ago, he died. And the process for making him a saint began in 2013. Now, there are 3 steps to sainthood without getting bogged down in the sort of bureaucracy of it all. But first, you need to have lived a heroically virtuous life. Then you need to have done one miracle, and then you can be declared blessed and be beatified. And then a second miracle is needed so that you can be canonized. So 2 miracles have been attributed to Carlo Acutis, this youngster who was known to be a big gamer and almost known as sort of the patron saint of the internet, who used his computer savviness to spread awareness of the Catholic faith. So the 2 miracles are, one took place, according to the Vatican, in 2013, where he interceded to save the life of a 4-year-old with a rare pancreatic condition. Now, this boy's mother prayed to Acutis, holding a relic. Now, a relic in this case would have been a piece of the boy's clothing, and he was cured. And then the second miracle was just this year in May. A girl from Costa Rica living in Florence fell off a bike, head trauma. Her mother went to Acutis' tomb and prayed to him, and she was saved. So it's interesting, Chris. We're talking about miracles. We're talking about saints in the year 2024. It almost seems kind of bizarre to be even discussing it, but in the Catholic world, this is what is happening. And he was born in London. There are statues of this teenager in Scotland and in Ireland, even closer to where you are. And interestingly, he was buried in Assisi, which is where there's the Basilica of St. Francis. But then his body body was moved in 2019. It was exhumed, and it is now in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And there are so many pilgrims going, and this boy's body is displayed in a glass case wearing jeans, sneakers, and a Nike sweatshirt.
That is one way to be displayed. No doubt the pilgrimages will only grow if he is now canonized as of next year. But before we let you go, Juliet, we do have one other story for you. The Pope is, as I understand this, has been a fan of tattoos in the past, or at least open to them, but he is now banning them.
So here it goes. The Pope has been known to say to priests, be understanding of young people with their tattoos, you know? There's a story to every tattoo. You can understand the person by looking at what they have chosen, what art they have chosen to put on their bodies and talking them through it. So this is the background to it. But now new rules have been issued at the Vatican for the employees of St. Peter's Basilica. So this is the personnel who work there. And one of the rules says that no visible tattoos or piercings are allowed and you risk suspension. Now, it's funny because I can imagine that we would all agree that perhaps the ushers who are inside the basilica herding the pilgrims around, going to see the Pietà and then perhaps attending a mass, that you wouldn't really expect them to have a massive tattoo showing. But included in the people who work for the basilica are the sort of artistic experts, laborers even, architects, and some of them carry out maintenance jobs. So it's raising a few eyebrows because you're kind of expecting all of them to either wear head-to-toe clothing and cover up with scarves any tattoos that might be peeping through their clothes. And otherwise that they should just not be working there simply because of their body art. Now, this is a whole new set of rules that have been issued. It's not just the tattoo rule. There's also rules that, personnel cannot attend rallies which are deemed inappropriate for a Vatican official, and that would imply not attending sort of gay pride rallies. And then there's also the fact that you have to be in a committed moral and religious relationship, no cohabiting, and you have to have a letter from the parish priest if you're going to work there. So it seems that they're getting pretty strict on a lot of things. But one interesting thing is they say no more nepotism. That's interesting, coming in a city and a country which is perhaps known for often having blood relatives in important positions simply because of their relationship.
Juliet Linley, thank you very much for joining us. That is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb, our researcher was Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.